Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Welcome to my video on the indirect and address functions in Microsoft Excel. I'm going to demonstrate how these functions work and how they may be helpful when working with data collected in counseling research. So I have some fictitious data here in the left part of this worksheet, and you can see the first variable is group, and there's two levels to group: control and treatment. And then we have another variable, gender, and the gender is represented here numerically. So 0 indicates a male participant and 1 indicates a female participant. And then the variable age, which is fairly straightforward. And then a post-test score, and let's say this is an instrument, these are scores from an instrument that measure the severity of depression symptoms. So taking a look at the indirect function, what the indirect function allows us to do is produce a value from anywhere in an Excel spreadsheet by supplying the function the address or the reference. So in the example I have here, if we want to know what the value is associated with B3, we would use the indirect function, and I have it here. It's fairly straightforward in this example. It's indirect, and the reference text, in this case cell E2, and we want to stay with A1 style, which is true. You see it is 0. And you can see I produced the reference text here using the address function, which I'll explain in a few moments. So another example here of indirect, if we wanted to find the value that appears at the coordinates C6, we would enter in indirect and then reference the cell E3, which contains the address C6. And again, it would be true, the A1 style, and we get 64. Of course, we look at C and then 6, we can see that's an age, and it's 64. Now, using the indirect function, we can also combine values. So say we wanted to find the value at cell D20. Right? So we know D20, the value is 57. But say we only had a cell here that contained the 20, well, we can actually type the D into the function. So indirect and a D in quotes, and the ampersand, and then reference, then insert E4, which of course is 20. And then we'll still stay with the A1 style, and that'll give us the value 57. Now there's another referencing style in Microsoft Excel other than the A1 style. It's called the R1C1 style. It's not particularly common, but in certain situations it can be fairly handy. And the indirect function can use the R1C1 style as well. So say we wanted to find the value or the coordinates row 11, so this would be row 11, and column 2, which we know would be 1. Right? We would use the indirect function the same way as we have before, except we would select false, which is the R1C1 style, and that'll return the value 1. Similarly, for row 4, column 3, row 4 and column 3, the value would be 69, it would be an age. We would use the indirect function, reference cell E6, which contains the reference R4C3, and select false. Now with the R1 C1 style, you can still combine, just as I did in the example for the A1 style. In this example before, I had the D come first and then the reference to E4. So I just switched around here. This will be R8, and we want to add C4 to it. So it would be indirect R8, ampersand, and then quotation mark C4, and close the quotation marks, and select false. That gives us the same value, 40, which is row 8 and column 4, is the value found at those coordinates. The indirect function can also be used with other functions, and I have a few of those demonstrated here. So I selected a reference text of D1 through D21. You can see that contains the string post test, which is the variable name. I want to show you how that's treated. So say we wanted to sum the values from D1 through D21. Now we know that post test is not going to be included in that sum, so it'll actually be D2 through D21 that is summed up, and we can see that's 993. You can see that's the value I have here. So we'd start with sum, and then we would nest the function indirect. This would be the reference text, E9, that contains the D1 colon D21. This is A1 style. You can see it returns 993. So say we want the average age. So that would be C2 to C21. Of course, both of these just in the control group. We could do the same thing with average. We start with average, and then indirect, reference E10 that contains C2 to C21. It would be A1 style. You see the average age for the control group is 60.25. So if I highlight that region, and down here you can see the average displayed, it is 60.25. So in this example, we're going to count the total number of ages represented in the cell C2 to C21. Of course, we know it's going to be 20. But we'll do that by nesting indirect in the count function. So we count indirect E11, again A1 style, and then 20. We could also take it a step further and use the Countif function. So say we want to count all the participants who are female in the control group. And we know that female is indicated by the number 1. So we would start with Countif, then indirect, then A1 style, and for criteria, we have quotation, equal mark 1, close quotation. We see it's 11. So there are 11 females in the control group. And then this last example, I just wanted to show you how you could nest the address function in the indirect function. So I used the coordinates 5 and 4, which would be row 5 and column 4, which you know the value should be 51. So we'd simply start with indirect, and then go right to address. Row number would be 5, column number would be 4, and it's going to default to the values 1 for the absolute number and for A1, and I'll get to those arguments in a minute, so I'm just going to close it here. You see it produces the same value. So moving over to the address function, which I've touched on just a little bit, we have here a row and a column, and I have them all set as row 3 and column 2, which is the same as B3. I want to show you the different ways you can use the address function. The first way is to create an absolute reference for both the row and the column, and that's denoted by the $ in front of the column and in front of the row, as you can see in this example B3. This is the default style for the address function. So you can see in the function bar I used the row, the column, and then a 1 and 1 as the arguments, but I don't really need those because it's the 1 and 1 are come in by default. So this would be address and row number, comma, column number. That gives you the absolute reference for both the row and the column. If we wanted a relative reference for the column, but still an absolute reference for the row, it would look like this. It would be B $3. The $, of course, representing that what follows is an absolute reference. So here we would use address, of course the row number and the column number as before, except now we would select absolute row, relative column, and the argument for that is 2, the number 2. And then of course it's still A1 style. You can see that gives us the relative column and the absolute row. Or you could do the reverse. In this case, this is an absolute column and a relative row. So again, we would start with address, the row number, the column number, and this time we would go with the relative row and absolute column, which is the value they're associated with is 3. And then A1 style. And you can see now we have an absolute column and a relative row. And of course you could make the whole reference relative. This is relative column and relative row, which would be address, row number, column number, and 4, which is relative, and of course A1 style, and you have B3, which is a relative reference. So for these next 4 values, the only thing different is in the last argument. As you can see here, the last argument is 1 for A1 style. I simply changed that to a 0, which is the R1C1 style. Again, not something you'd necessarily see often, but I wanted to show you how the address function worked in relation to the R1C1 style. And these 4 values are the equivalent of these 4 values, except in R1C1 style. Address will also let you point to an address that's on a different worksheet. So I have an empty worksheet in this workbook called Data 1. So if we want an absolute reference to Data 1 in A1 style for the cell B3, we would go to the address function. Again, the same row number and column number, absolute reference and A1 style, and then in quotation marks, Data 1, which is the name of the worksheet. Close quotation marks. I'll expand this a bit so you see that's data 1 and an exclamation mark and then the absolute reference for B3. The address function can also be used to return the address of the cell that the function is in, which I've done here. Now, of course, when I do it here, it's going to show you a different value because it's a different cell. It's address, and then row, and then parentheses, open and close, and then column, and again, open and close, with the parentheses. You see it returns an absolute reference, K11, which is the cell that I typed in. Again, you see here I had the optional arguments 1 and 1, but since those come in by default, this returns, this is essentially the same function. It returns a different value because it's a different cell, but it's the same function. So I hope this video on the indirect and address functions was helpful to you. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to assist you.